So welcome back. We're at 8:10. So
while Karl's doing that, there was a slide. I think I lost it in version control somewhere around the line here, but Paul Krugman has been struggling to find what his favorite measure of rent, and including this, including that, or including this, excluding that. So it seems to be like a hobby of a lot of economists I follow on Twitter of what's the best measure of rent with including certain things, excluding things. Krugman's favorite version is really, he takes rent out because he looks at it as it's already become very small, but using that slide that I showed you a minute ago, the left-hand side chart showing that rent inflation is pretty close to zero now. So what he does is he removes that, and his favorite measure now is like a super core, takes out rent, it's core inflation minus rent. It's like 3% annualized is his number. He says that's where he thinks inflation is right now. That's the best measure of it versus a year ago. And he does a 6-month rolling average of that. So he adds an average of the last 6 months. So presumably those prior months were a little higher and some of the more recent ones are a little lower, but he thinks 3% is where we're at. So for what it's worth. Okay, so this slide, are we able to blow this up and zoom in?
Sure.
All right. Probably, okay, there it is. Look at that. All right. So this shows how much wages, how well wages for production and non-supervisory workers, which is the middle class, probably the bottom 65 or 70% of workers, the non-management workers, what's happened with their wages relative to the main measures of inflation, starting with February 2020, which was the sort of the peak pre-pandemic month. So this was before the pandemic really starts to hit any of the economic measures. 2020 or the fourth quarter of 2019 are what people usually use for those to get those starting points. And so wages are up almost 20%, CPI about 17, and the core about 15. So what that means is that in theory, purchasing power is higher now than it was. And keep in mind, there's some footnotes in the left there that wages do not include the checks and other stuff that people had or pandemic savings. That's on top of this. This is just that wages have kept up and are, in theory, the average wage earner has more purchasing power now than they had before the pandemic. Meaning, despite all that inflation noise, it's sort of who cares? I got more money in my pocket. I can buy more stuff now than I could back in 2019. And you don't hear that in the news very often, if at all, but it is simply the math on average. And yeah, I think, Karl, you're going to say it's about core?
No, I was just going to say that
then it's really a big
obviously, these are on average, the average worker is better. Most workers are better off, but there are clearly some that are not.
Right. That's right. And it depends on, where you are. If you are a rural, you've got a gas guzzling truck and you're in a rural area where you've got to drive around to a lot of places and you're a renter, the inflation is hitting you pretty hard. You're paying a lot for rent and previously you were paying a lot for gas. If you don't have a lot of flexibility in the food that you buy and eat, you're forced to get eggs and other things that have gone up tremendously in price, then they may be hitting you a little bit harder. On the other hand, if you are a homeowner, if you are a person that has been able to get these big wage gains, and you're a homeowner, you might not be suffering very much at all, actually. So it just depends on the person. But we looked at this a couple months back, and probably the top, somewhere between the top 80 and 95% are better off now than they were in 2019 in terms of the wages, and then also when you include all the other stuff that people got, the checks and everything else. People are better off than they were in 2019, and that's a point that we need to make often, I think, to the world, is that there's sort of this view that things were better in 2019. There wasn't any inflation. Well, you had 20% wage gains that you didn't have back then. So it's we have to tell the story, and of course, it usually falls to Democrats to tell a more complicated story. But that's the way it is.
Is this unusual historically in modern history of the United States for wages to be outstripping inflation like this over several years?
No, in general, they've done it over the long term.
Interesting to know.
And let's look, well, let's do the next 2 slides on that too, to give you a little bit of background on that. So there's a couple ways of
As a
answering that question.
whole, isn't the world becoming more wealthy? I mean, isn't that what a good economy does?
We were, I would say depending on where you were in the distribution, somewhere in 2021 for everybody in the US on average, and then in 2022 for the bottom 50%, that's when their net worth peaked. But yes, you're correct in that net worth tends to climb every year. We are a big wealth generating economy. It's just different groups experience that differently as well.
Well, even the whole world, except perhaps with some of the side effects of COVID shutdowns and stuff, but over the last 50 years, haven't even the poorest countries gotten wealthier, reduced starvation?
Absolutely, yes.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, globalization has been a huge wealth generator for the world, as much as it does leave some people behind, but on average, the vast majority have gone up significantly in wealth. But we don't have the slide here today on it, but for instance, the net worth of the bottom 50% in the US got wiped out after 2008 because of the housing, and a lot of people had housing leverage and they lost their houses. On average, that group got killed in that 2008 crisis and shortly thereafter. And then lately, there's been a big resurgence in that into that 2021, 2022 timeframe. The big housing gains, big stock market gains until 2021, generally. So, but to answer this question on real wages, it's a little tricky to answer it. I'm going to give you 2 answers. The next slide is probably a better answer to that question, but let me show you this one. The real wages are higher now, so this is adjusted for inflation. Real wages are higher now than they were in February of 2020, and about 2.3% higher. Biden has, if you just take his 2 years in office, so 2021, 2022, he has the highest real hourly wages of any president. And you can see in this graph, he doesn't have that top spike, which was still under Trump, but almost everything else in that 29 range. Once you get into Biden, 29, and then it's fallen down toward 28.50 and coming back to 28.75. All that's Biden, and that is the highest of any president. If this were to continue, just at this level, Biden has the record. Now let's take a look at the next slide, and this gives you a better answer to the question that came up earlier. Real wages have sort of gone between these 2 giant peaks. So for a very long time, from 1970 all the way into mid-1990s, let's say, real wages didn't typically go up. Inflation was higher than wages. Now, once you get into the mid-90s, it's been on a pretty much a steady upward climb, with some exceptions, like after 2008, came down a little bit. But for the most part, real wages have gone back up and are now the highest they've ever been, and have been since, they've been, let's see, if you look at 1973, that was 28.29. And so in 2021, and, so from 2020, 2021, 2022, all 3 of those years were higher than 1973. So there's, I guess, a 2-part answer to your question. Did wages outdo inflation? The answer would be from 1995 to now, generally yes. If you go back from 1970 to 1995, the answer would be generally no. So that's where we are. But if you look at Biden's 2022 and 2021, and Trump's best 2 years would have been those last couple, and Biden was above those. So, and there was no president that had many years of this. We'll see what happens with real wages over time, but you have to go back into who was president in the early 70s? Who was the lucky guy in 73, 74? Is it Nixon? Sure. Okay. So Nixon would have probably been pretty close if we only looked at a couple of his years, but as you go back further, you can see that number drops off. So we'll see if this number starts falling quickly, but right now it is very high. And so when people talk about the negatives of inflation and how bad it's been, the wages have been keeping up. And so the real wages are very, very high. This is something the media does not talk about. What they usually talk about, if you go back
on this chart, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, the Civil Rights Act of 64 made it illegal to discriminate against women and minorities. And so we had more women and minorities coming into the workforce. If you look at women's workforce participation, it picked up a lot in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so the mix of workers included more women, and women were earning less than men. And so it'd be interesting to see this chart for men only, to see how much of it is a factor of the mix of workers. The other thing is that professionals, which make up a higher percentage of the workforce these days, are not included in these numbers. And so when you look at the Census Bureau real median earnings, you see slightly different results than this.
Yeah. No, good point. This is the wages of those production and non-supervisory workers again. You can see it in the center label here, and I talked about it before. But that's the group, and it's somewhere like the bottom 65% or so. I get a good number on that, but it's more than the bottom half. And actually, the folks at the bottom have had faster wage gains than the folks at the top. When you look at the Biden, what the media likes to talk about is they pretend that the world only goes on for 1 year. And so if you look at the prior slide, then what they will say is real wages are falling under Biden. And that's the bad news narrative that you hear. Nobody says, yeah, but the real wages are higher than they've ever been under any president. They just say, look, real wages were 29 in 2021, and now they're 28. You know, they were in the middle of 2020, so they were 28, and now they're 27.50. They don't show you this historical perspective of real wages are incredibly high. It's a great time to be a worker right now in terms of your purchasing power. That is a story that the media has entirely hidden, and it's incumbent on us to share the facts and make sure that they know it. And every time I get a chance, I'm always harassing the Washington Post people that love to explain how real wages are down over the past year. It's like, I don't give a darn. Real wages are the highest they've ever been.
So explain exactly what
is baloney.
What exactly is that difference? It was higher under Trump at a peak, but Biden has the record because what exactly do I say?
Well, okay, look at these numbers right here in the upper right-hand corner.
Yeah.
President Biden, the average real wage for production and non-supervisory workers under Biden is higher than any other president. And
in other words,
the peak was in 2021 under Biden at $29. This is an annual, these lines are only the annual average. So 2021, the average real wage was $29. That's the highest it's ever been for a year on average. And that might be what you say. That 2021 was the best year to be a production and non-supervisory worker in terms of purchasing power, $29 an hour. And in 2022, it fell to $28.56. If you were to compare that to Trump, the last 2 years of Trump, because right, we only got 2 years of Biden, full year, 2 years of Trump, Biden's still better. So real wages were higher under Biden than under Trump, and you can see it if you average those. If you were to take just the best 2 years of Trump and compare it to Biden's best 2 years, or his only 2 years so far, that are all in the books, Biden's better. But it's just, however you spin that, this is, I would just say 2021. Real wages are the highest they've ever been in 2021. Or you could say the average in 2021 and 2022 is the highest ever. What I've said before is that 2022 was the third highest real wage year ever. Going back to 1964 is how far back this chart goes. But, you know, you can use this slide. You can use the slide before it if you want, but this one, you know, puts it into historical perspective. I kind of like this chart better than the last one, but it's just the media just says, oh, the real wages are down a little bit. They don't give any context at all. Like, things are bad, the real wage is down. It's like, dude, look, real wages are awesome. These are fun. You know, and I did it last month or the month before. I did this as a percentile. I think real wages now, like the last reading, was like 96th percentile, meaning it's higher than 96% of the monthly readings going back to 1964. It's like, you can take a look at last month's presentation. That's a statistic I like, although people don't understand percentiles. It's like higher than 96% of the time going back to 64. These are really high real wages. And this idea that inflation is breaking the American consumer is ridiculous. It's not. You know, the Wall Street Journal of all places, a about 6 months ago, they had an article that said American households are in the best financial shape in decades. You know, all this bad news, households in the best financial shape in decades. You know, we shared that here, went through it. It's just, there are so many measures that are right near the 100th percentile right now. You've got really low unemployment, most people working ever, extremely high real wages. So that includes the inflation concept. It's a very, this is why the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates like 10 times and then they just paused, is because it's a ridiculously strong economy. And it's been, think of it this way, the budget deficit got cut in half. The Federal Reserve has raised interest rates to a very high level, and they raised it 10 times in a row, and you still have the economy at 96th percentile on all these measures. That's how strong this economy is, and you do not get that message in the media. And that's where we gotta deliver that message.
I mean, the other thing to remember is that these wages do not include government benefits. And so when you talk about how the average, person and household are doing, there are a lot more government benefits now than there were in 1973. There's a new book out that I have not read yet. I've ordered it from my library about the myth of inequality. And it talks about the extent to which government benefits not being included in the official statistics distort things like the measure of inequality or the measure of poverty.
All right, let's keep going.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Can I add something? This is Diane.
Sure.
I think what we need to think about too is that people who are living near the poverty line, or people even in the working class or middle class, tend to use credit cards to pay for things a lot more. And those interest rate hikes by Powell have been killing those people. I'm one of them. So yeah, the prices of things aren't necessarily affecting my bottom line, but those interest rate hikes sure are.
Yep. Well, the Fed is trying, and that's deliberate, by the way, right? They're trying to do that to you. They want you to stop spending, so they are trying their best to make it hard for you to spend. That's exactly what they're trying to do. You're exactly right. I wish they wouldn't, but that's what they're doing.
I don't want to create more work for David and Karl, because I think they do an outstanding job and obviously spend a lot of work into these presentations. But as a side question, don't research this if you don't know, but I don't really understand why credit card rates are as much higher than the prime as they have typically been. It seems a mystery to me. Is it because we don't have more credit card companies? Like, is there a monopoly here that needs to be broken? Is something else at work? Does anybody know? I mean, and the other thing that seems unfair to me is when somebody has trouble paying them, then they start raising their interest rates, and that includes purchases they've already made. And that doesn't seem all that equitable either, even though I understand they signed a contract saying it's okay. But what choice did they have? Because there isn't.
Let's research it now. Bring it up. I mean, it's an interesting question: is why would there be this giant markup from sort of if the bank borrows at X and then they're lending to you at Y? Why is there such a giant gap? Why hasn't competition whittled that down? And
there isn't any competition to speak of. And
that might be it. Yeah.
And the other point is that they're charging a lot of interest, but they're not paying it. Like my savings account is at the same crummy 1.4% or whatever that it's been at, despite the fact that interest rates have been hiked 10 times.
You can get a much higher savings rate than that right now.
You have to chase interest rates to a different bank, and that's a pain in the butt, and everybody knows it, and that's why they keep them low. Some banks have responded differently, but we're going back to credit cards. In a lot of states, with the interest rates where they are now, the credit card rates are close to the usury maximums, and so That's why they aren't higher.
So they would be higher if they could legally get more, is what we're really saying.
That's business. That's what they do. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Um,
I took a slide out here too that was like corporate profits were up like, you know, when you looked at those charts that showed like wages up 20%, the inflation up 15 or 17%, corporate profits over that time were, I think they peaked up at like 50% and now they're up 35 or 40%. So corporations are not hurting in this world.
I hate to be a cynic, but we've talked about in the past why, and it's been one of my pet peeves, though not exactly the issue you presented, about how certain affluent people, particularly CEOs who get paid $10 million in stock options, don't have to pay ordinary earned income tax on that. It's not like they're investing it for their retirement and that kind of stuff. But I've sort of wondered if one of the reasons these things don't get fixed is, or maybe the reason the credit card stuff doesn't get fixed is maybe these organizations and these people are big donors and we don't want to piss off our big donors. So maybe we've been bought and paid for. Maybe both parties are bought and paid for. I mean, that cynical suggestion has been out there. And I'm not sure that there's not a certain modicum of merit to it.
Well,
that could be true, but this, you know, Elizabeth Warren was charged with heading up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and where is that? Whatever happened to that? Trump disbanded it, but Biden didn't do anything to re-engage it either.
I would ask you to investigate that. I think you find out that they're turning into much significant activists. Over the last couple of years, they've been popping their head out everywhere, and yeah, they're back.
I remember when we broke up AT&T, you know, the Bell system. I'm trying to think of who we've broke up since. I'm sure there's somebody, but
yeah, and of course that worked so well.
All right, let's keep going. But I think there's some interesting research stuff here. I've taken some notes, so we'll see if we can.
Again, I didn't mean to give you that as a task, David.
No. The reason I do this presentation every month is not like it's like, oh no, I got to do the presentation. And I do this. This is fun for me to try to figure out what's going on in the world and then try to explain it. It's one of I do this on Wikipedia too. I have articles help write on Wikipedia, and I do it all over Twitter. So I like to do this. And when you ask questions that are interesting like that, I'm like, well, let's see, what can we find out? I have to be careful because I think Christine is here as well and works at Discover. My wife works at Discover, so when they release public information about what they're doing, I always ask my wife, "What's going on at Discover? What are they doing with their credit card?" And she's like, well, "I can't tell you until this goes public." So I have to be careful with what. I don't have any dirt now, but I mean, I have to make sure that everything's available publicly before I comment on it. But I've seen some slides from them in the past where they get into their delinquency and they get into their what's going on with their lending base. It's very interesting to see what's going on inside of a corporation.
And we don't want to see you hauled in front of congressional hearings either.
No, I don't want to get myself or my wife in trouble. So I make sure these are public. I get them out of their annual report or quarterly reports when I do. But every now and then we'll share slides about what's going on in an individual corporation. Like we did some stuff with the Silicon Valley Bank. I think it was 2 months ago. And so you guys had a chance to see the actual financial statements. We went into kind of what happened at that bank and kind of broke it down. And so sometimes going in, we talk macroeconomics generally here, but to go micro every now and then is kind of fun to see what's happening. All right, other economic statistics. This is just other cool stuff that's happening. So let's go through that. So the Fed just did their new forecast, and it's very interesting to see what happened here. This was really kind of a wow thing for me. So if you look at 2023, what they do here is each of these variables has two lines, the March projection, and then the top line is going to be the June projection. So let's just look at 2023 because the out years didn't change all that much. What they said is March, they thought the real GDP growth rate for 2023 was going to be 0.4, so pretty slow growth. Faster growth is something north of 2%. Now they bumped that back up to 1. For the unemployment rate, they were saying probably we were going to get into a possible recession this year. They were saying 4.5% unemployment rate. Now they're saying 4.1. these two measures tell us that the economy is a lot stronger than they thought it was in March. And to my point earlier, despite the big deficit reduction, despite the Fed raising interest rates 10 times, the Fed is still raising their forecast for how good the economy is doing. So, all right, the PCE inflation was pretty flat, but the core was up, which kind of is consistent with them saying the economy is hotter than they think. The inflation is also going to be hotter than they thought, you know. So they bumped that up a little bit. But the big one, the big news, which didn't seem to hit stock markets the way I thought it would, is the last one, where they said in March they thought the interest rates were going to be 5.1 at the end of this year, which is about where they are now. They're saying 5.6 now, which is a couple more interest rate hikes. Remember, at the last meeting, they didn't raise the rates anymore. And now this says we're expected to do it twice more. I'm hoping that this is just the Fed messaging, meaning they want to they don't want inflation expectations to get unhinged. They want to scare people. But the fact that they're saying 5.6 at the end of this year is sending a warning to everybody that interest rates are going to go up a couple more times. Stock market shook it right off, meaning in theory that was expected, but I don't think it was expected. So, you know, you short-term stock market speculators, you just watch yourselves here for a few days. But again, if you're a stock market long-term investor, don't worry about it. But for this, you know, rates might go up a couple more times. Maybe the other side of the coin is maybe they see that as the end, meaning, okay, rates aren't going over 5, 6, no way they're going higher than that. And then it's going to be downhill from there. And so the stock market's already starting to think about the downhill on the interest rates, which is, you know, that's going to be a huge boom in the stock market, I think, when those rates go back down toward 2 or 1% over the next few years. But that, anyway, what they're saying here is the economy is doing a lot better than we thought. So we're raising our forecast for growth. We're lowering it for the unemployment rate. We're raising inflation because the economy is doing stronger, so there should be more inflation. And the Fed funds rate is also going to be a lot higher than we had previously forecast. Very interesting. See, we've got a message here. What did he say? Powell said interest rate reductions would be years away, not in 2024. Okay, that's fair. That you're right. He has said that he would expect to be holding these rates high for some time. But you can see here, unless he's changing, going back already on his forecast, that he was looking at lower interest rates in 2024 and 2025. So we shall see. But he may be backpedaling on some of this. Maybe that's why the stock market didn't react negatively to 2023, because 2024 looked good, but those are still higher. You see, those are still higher than they were forecasting before. So I don't know. Understanding what's going on in the stock market is a mystery day in and day out. But they are saying, bottom line, this is a stronger economy than we thought in March. Our interest rates aren't doing as much as we figured they would. And again, that is some. If you're the president, that is something you can definitely use to say, look at how strong this economy is. All right, let's keep going. So when the NBER is the group, it's a group of very usually pretty famous economists, like Ben Bernanke was on it. The National Bureau of Economic Research, they have a committee that decides when the economy has hit a peak. And what's happening right now is 5 of the 6 key measures they use are up for the year, meaning they're showing growth. They're not showing recession. There's one measure that teal blue, I think, it's real manufacturing and trade industry sales, which is a measure you never hear of anywhere else but here. But when the NBER is talking about it, it's never in the news. I don't even know what it is, to be honest. But the other measures, the employment measures, the personal consumption measures, industrial production, the index, overall, all of them are up, all of them are positive. This is not a recession story. This is a growth story. And again, strong economy. Now, despite all that good news, the interest rates are so crazy right now that they are predicting a 71% chance of recession by May of 2024. Meaning, and one way to look at it, spinning it positively, is to say the economy is so good that it's really hard to maintain it at this peak. You know, you can't just hit a plateau that's this incredibly high plateau and maintain it forever. It's like, you know, running a 4-minute mile. You can't just keep doing that indefinitely. Some Kenyan runners are giving it a stretch, are giving it a shot, but it's, you know, you can only keep at that pace for so long, and then you have to slow down. And so it's kind of a no-brainer to say, yeah, we were at 3.4% unemployment. How long are we haven't had that since 1969. How long are we going to be able to maintain that? Would be nice if we could keep it forever, but it's not going to happen. And so the longer we're at these amazingly high peaks, I would think that the chances of recession would go up. But these are basically generated from interest rate differences, unusual things going on with the Federal Reserve raising rates so quickly. Long-term rates haven't reacted as fast, and so you have these numbers are very close together, and that gives you an indication of recession. And it's up from 25% chance in August of last year. So about a year ago, the chance was only 25%. Now it's at 70%. So yes, there's risk of recession. If you look at that Fed forecast I just showed you, that is not a very serious recession that they're predicting. I mean, it's higher unemployment than now, but it's not a very significant one. So if we did have one, wouldn't be that bad. But they're saying it's not going to happen most likely in 2023. These interest rates have been in this range. The unemployment rate has been in this 3.4 to 3.7 range since like March of 22. It's been over a year that unemployment rate has been in this narrow, very low band. And so anyway, this is what they're showing from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So we always share this to give you that perspective on, not everybody thinks we're in the clear.
If the administration wanted to push this out until after the 2024 election, what kinds of policies and things could we do to make sure that the recession happens in 2025 after the election, or at least in December of 2024, where it's less likely to negatively affect the election, and where either the Democratic president will have 4 more years for things to get better, or we can blame the Republican president? Are there things we can do to push that out?
The traditional one is you spend on something. So you would increase the budget deficit on something. I mean, one thing that Biden did do is he passed that $1 trillion infrastructure bill, which they'll be spending over the next decade. There's something like 30,000 projects or something that are funded through there for all 50 states. And so that's going to help. But it's usually when you think about what's going to affect the Fed forecaster better than sort of the trend line we're on, you have to raise the budget deficit. It's typically what the president can do through fiscal policy. In theory, they can do things better. You can always try to improve productivity. You can come up with some brilliant innovation, but chances are, realistically, it's you spend on something. And right now, it's hard to even spend, because even if you did spend a lot of money, there aren't a lot of workers to spare. So this is not a great time to be doing heavy-duty deficit spending. And if the economy slows down a little bit, I think that the smartest thing the administration can do is messaging. Is tell people this is an unbelievably good economy. Here's the data. Look at these awesome graphs that the best graphic designer in the world that worked for the president should be able to be creating. And they should be sharing all this ad nauseum through everybody that works in the Democratic Party that's an elected politician should have their interns spreading the word. It's summer. The interns are all there. Spread the word, people. And that's what you do. And then as the economy starts to go, if it does, then you start to say, okay, then you do the damage control. And the unemployment rate went from the lowest since 1969 from 97th percentile to 85th. We're still B plus, people. It's at 4%. I mean, you message around this. I don't think you're definitely not going to get a big, budget deficit increasing thing out of this Congress.
Well, on the other hand, there have been a lot of days when there's been a 71% chance of rain and it hasn't rained. We could sidestep a recession here. It could very much happen. I think it's this battle of rent versus energy that's going to be the determining factor. Because if we get inflation down, because rent does what those charts show, it's starting to come down. If it starts to come down and the energy prices don't go crazy, inflation goes away, the Fed's happy. They can tell everybody we're leaving the interest rates where they are for a while. And that sort of puts the floor wherever we are at that stage. That's about where we are, and we hope that continues for a while. There isn't, geopolitical stuff can always happen. OPEC can get really organized, do a huge cut in production. The Russian war could get worse.
Ukraine could collapse and Russia goes in there. There are a variety of things that could happen. You can't predict them all, but we got an awesome economy now. Let's make sure everybody knows it.
I
And
take
then
it
if
a
it changes,
Taiwan
change it.
invasion would be bad too.
Yeah, that's another one right at the top of the risk list. I mean, it's something like that. And it may not be the most likely, but if it happened, it would be horrible. Yeah, we don't want to be in a war with China. As much as, we just, I can't imagine. I don't want to think about it. So let's not. But it's messaging, I think, is what we do now. You jawbone this. The Fed funds rate is about 5.1% right now, and the expectations for inflation 5 or 10 years out are just above 2%. They're right where they need to be. This is where the Fed wants them, and they want to keep the pressure on. They can see these rates actually fall down probably under 2%. We haven't quite seen, if you look at that line, they've gotten really close, but they haven't quite hit 2% yet. And this is a weekly measure that the Fed gets. So I think of this as one of the best real-time statistics that the Fed can use to see if what they're doing is working. And I think it is working, that these numbers are getting down toward 2. So that's good news. All right, so this is an interesting sort of storyline that's going on, and we've got a few slides on this. People are extremely negative about this economy, and there isn't a definitive answer of why. Is it some of it could be economic, meaning they really weigh inflation and gas prices heavily, but those have gotten better lately, and the sentiment has not gotten much better. At least as of the time that I did this, there's been like the latest monthly observation was a little better. But we have really negative views of what's going on. People don't think we're on the right track. People are not optimistic about the economy. Consumer sentiment, which is what we'll focus on, is very low. And presidential approval is low, although not horribly low, for the last, it was pretty bad for some times as well. So Stephen Ratner worked for the Obama administration. He was part of the turnaround for the auto industry and did some other things for them. I think he's an investment banker now. You might recognize him from, he's the guy who does the Morning Joe charts. And I've got some of them here, and we'll use them. But his basic thesis is, people have a really negative view of the economy. Why is that? Because the reality of the economy is way, way better. So let's look at this. So one of the ways, next slide, there's this thing called the misery index. It is the sum of inflation versus a year ago and the unemployment rate. And this is what it's been historically. It's in the middle of its range right now. It's actually better than historical average right now, believe it or not, because the unemployment rate is so low and the inflation has come down. It's actually 60th percentile, meaning it's better than 60% of our history. So this is based on just those two measures, not the job creation, not other things. It is a better than average economy on these two measures together using the misery index. So keep that number in mind, 60th percentile, better than average economy on this measure. Now let's look at the sentiment numbers. Sentiment numbers right now for Biden are these blue circles, and they are consumer sentiment could score up to 100 or so. When you do the numbers right now, consumer sentiment at a score of 50, so that vertical axis consumer sentiment index and the misery index along the bottom, Biden is way below where you'd expect him to be. You would expect him to be on that black dotted line, that diagonal line through the middle. Instead, almost all these Biden measures, each circle is a month, are way below the line. Why are things so negative for Biden? And they weren't for Trump, with the exception of a few months that are red. Trump he was just above that. So we'll see here, right now, even though the misery index is 60th percentile, consumer sentiment right now is 7th percentile, meaning it's worse than 93% of our history. That score of 50, June 22, okay, but the score April 23, there it is. That circle that says April 23, that score of around 60 was like 7th percentile. It's really bad. You can see all these gray dots are above it, almost all of them. There's a few that are below it. And so why is that? Why is sentiment so terrible when, at least on the misery index scale, you're at 60th percentile? As I've shared before, like the unemployment rate is like 95th, 96th percentile. Real wages are like 96th percentile. More people are working than ever, so you're 100th percentile. how fast how fast job creation has been. I don't have a percentile on that, but Biden is the fastest of any president, so it's going to be pretty darn high. Again, I keep having this idea of writing an op-ed for the New York Times called "The 96th Percentile Economy." Why doesn't anybody like it? And it's interesting, but it's an incredible difference. And so the next slide shows the differences when you compare that misery index percentile and the consumer sentiment percentile. You get this graph, and it looks like, all right, yeah, it's a little distorted by the translation over from, no, it's fine. It just looks different. When the blue line is above that, okay, so there's this, let me start again. There's this diagonal line, straight line down the middle. That's the trend over time, which has been a downward trend, meaning people are crankier than usual, have become increasingly cranky. Given the same set of data, people are going to have a more negative view of it. Under Reagan, back in March of '84, so in the upper left, sentiment was 92nd percentile. People were happy, 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 but the misery index was 12th percentile. The economy we had high inflation, high unemployment. This is the power of the media and a gifted, and I'll give Reagan credit where it was due, a gifted, charismatic communicator, a guy who can really tell a story. And, he was an actor. He was really good at it. And he had and I call this the perception gap, the difference in those two numbers, the 92nd percentile sentiment minus the 12th percentile misery gives you an 80% gap. That's euphoria. People were just, everything's great, even though the economy sucks. Our they're very hopeful and positive consumers. You look where we are right now in the bottom lower right corner, sentiment is about 7th percentile, misery index is 60th percentile. There's a negative 53 gap. That is a huge, a gigantic difference. If you look at different times in our history where we had the misery index around the 60th percentile, you get a range of the sentiment between 25 and 80%, 80th percentile. People can be very happy at this misery index because it's actually a better than average index if you're selling it. And that's where, having a communicator in chief that is out there all the time and hammering these messages and having the whole Democratic machine hammering these messages is so important. And it's just, is it that inflation has stopped us? Is it that there's other negativity like these, the other news that's happening that's not necessarily economic out in the world, the war, other things, the pandemic sort of, and we don't know exactly why sentiment is so bad, but what we are seeing is that even with inflation, even with the misery index making big improvements recently because the inflation dropped, the sentiment is not getting better. It's still really bad. And you can see it's been a trend over time, but still, Biden is way below that line that I showed you in the prior chart. So I'll ask it as a question. What do you guys think of that difference? Why do you think we've got such a big difference in sentiment and reality?
If I were looking at this, and if I'm looking at it correctly, it looks like it was up for Obama as well. And as you pointed out, Reagan did have a gift in communicating, acting, whatever. It may reflect that people don't really have confidence in Biden's ability to produce a better future, independent of whether or not he and his advisors are making policy decisions that are great. Would that be a fair analysis?
That's a possibility. I won't count it out.
It's marketing.
This is where
Come on.
his age.
I'd say Fox News.
Fox News.
Yeah,
No,
I think
Fox
it's
News
part of it,
existed
right?
under Obama too, so it's hard to.
yeah, but it's gotten so much worse than Obama left. And Reagan, when he was in office, there wasn't any social media or all these things either, So, I feel like it's a combination too. And yeah, marketing, I think, the Democrats don't market. I don't know. It's just crime. Everybody here is freaked out about crime. They're afraid of everything. I just know the people I know, they think,
Go ahead.
No, I just think people are like, you're going to the city? I'm like, yeah, I go. I'm cautious, but I'm still going. You know, everybody's like freaked out around here. I don't know about other states. They probably have their own issues, but.
Yeah, I'm just trying to stay out
Anyways.
of Willowbrook.
Pardon?
I said, I'm trying to
Well-
stay out of Willowbrook.
Well, yeah, I mean, anything nowadays with all the shootings around here, I don't know how people would feel about it other places, but I just think it's a combination. I do agree with Christina. A lot of it is all the marketing from so many different sources that we didn't have during Reagan's time. We just didn't have it, you know?
That's true. Also, I mean, the Republicans will tell you that we have under a Democratic president, we have a terrible economy. You know, people are not getting better. The economy is getting worse for workers. What we have is a number of liberal progressive Democrats echoing that message.
Yes, marketing.
Yeah.
So, and this is what's fascinating, right? Eggs are no longer $5 a dozen, right? Gasoline hasn't gone back to $5.50 a gallon. You know, the world is slowly coming to grips with the fact that, you know, our lives are going to move on. Inflation's coming down. Yeah, it's happening. The trick is, yeah, the people on Pod Save America, you know, the speechwriters for Obama, as they discussed, it's very tough, like when they were writing speeches for Obama. How do you go rah-rah for the environment or for whatever you're rah-rahing about and alienate a whole bunch of people who think you're full of shit? And so you're sort of stuck.
Yeah.
You know, we do need groups like the one we're doing here to say the world probably isn't that bad. Are you sure your world is really that bad?
Yeah.
It's just not that bad.
Again, for most of us, you know.
Our culture today is just so saturated with negative messages. I always feel like that's the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
It's not even specific. It's not even specific to anything.
We have entire AI algorithms designed to figure out how to get you more and more angry, so that you scroll more and more.
I think my answer is a combination of all your comments here. I do these civics surveys, CIV, IQS, and I do them every couple of weeks, and they come out. I don't think it's scientific. People just sign up. I did one the other day, and it was asking me what my opinions of the economy and are we in the right track, the wrong track? You know, am I optimistic? Am I not? And as soon as you fill it out, you get results as to where you are. The other day, there were 281,000 people who had responded. I just looked it up. There's over 481,800 that have responded, but they are mimicking exactly the opinion out there where it says that 66% of the people think we're on the wrong direction. 25 think we're on the right direction. Now, what's interesting is they break this up down by age strata, by political camps, male, female, etc. And if I click on Republicans, it'll be in the high 80% we're on the wrong track. If I click on Democrats, it'll say that probably, and I'm just going to click on Democrats just to double check this. It says that 50% believe we're on the right track, 32% on the wrong track. Now, when I look at by the way, the Republicans were 97% on the wrong track. The independents, though, say that we are 73% on the wrong track, which is a little scary. But I truly believe everybody is cloistered in their own media. So those people who watch Fox or watch Max, all say here is that we are on the wrong track. They use words like failing economy, failing administration, and here we are. I've been texting, I've been tweeting during this meeting, saying, "Boy, things are really good out there," and people are going, "What world are you living in? Have you checked the price of gas lately?" I mean, it's like it's slightly bizarre, but this misery index is not being reflected in how people actually perceive the economy by what they're being told. You know,
Yep.
I hope, David, that you put out more tweets. I try to amplify those, and we ask the organization to, as soon as you put one out there. I've asked the Truth Brigade from Indivisible to pick up your tweets, but it isn't resonating. Maybe it's just because people like bad news. I don't know, but I just wanted to share that. I mean, a survey with 481,000 people is an amazing survey.
It is. They got that good a response rate. That is tremendous. And the ability of people to quote Fox News is impressive. It is really impressive.
David,
Go ahead.
I'll agree with most everything that other people have said, but we tend to be looking at this, or the conversation here is looking at this from a Democratic versus Republican point of view. My sentiment is that there are commercial actors who have a vested interest in portraying the economy as being negative. Most of these are financial actors, credit companies, banks, insurance companies, healthcare, that's quote unquote healthcare providers, caulking Medicaid, Medicare insurance, and Social Security, threats to Social Security. And I hear this as a constant message. I hear this in the morning when I'm shaving. I hear this on the rare times that I'm up at 2 a.m. watching terrible late night TV, if you know what I mean. And there's a certain hits certain demographics. And I think that that really, when you talk about messaging, that messaging is really a commercial messaging serving a commercial interest, which doesn't necessarily reflect our reality.
No, it's a fair point. I think there's people out there, groups with financial incentives to make things look bad. And if you think about it, if you're a corporation, if you were a human, you would want the lowest taxes possible, which means you would do everything in your power to bring Republicans into power. And if and they have quite a bit of power to do that. And that's a great point you make, that there is a big financial incentive for corporations to have Republicans in charge, at least from a tax perspective. Now, I'm not sure a lot of them realize that how much better the economy does under Democrats. I think if they knew that, if they reacted to that rationally, they might be rah-rahing the economy a little bit more. But I think a lot of executives are conservative. They're Republican, and they want the taxes lower, and that's how they judge how they want to be politically active, or want their organizations to be politically active.
They get their information from the Wall Street Journal editorial page.
Yeah, that too. Yep.
Well, let me throw something else in. If I was to take that survey, I would probably come off pretty negative, because I think although the economy is doing well, the guidance is so influenced by these anarchy types in Congress, and the culture wars are so going the wrong way, in my opinion, that I would say explicitly that we're on the wrong track, even though I would definitely say that I thought, Democrats do the economy better and Biden is doing a good job. But I would come down on those other lines in terms of the way I perceive a macro situation. so what I'm saying is, got to be real careful how you ask a survey question.
That's true. The question, is the country moving in the right direction? Well, by whose metric? By what metric? The economy wise, Congress wise? Yeah, in Congress, it's a mess, but the economy's good. So how do you even answer that?
I would love to know what, and I think Mark asked the question here too. What would it take to make them think the economy or the country is on the right track? Like what would the policies look like that would mean right track? And I would love to see what that would be. I'm sure they would be very different for Republicans and Democrats.
I would hate to see what most of the right-wing supporters, the base, would say if they actually, if the Congress was actually able to implement what they planned to do. They would be they would be, first of all, they got an economic smackdown, that would be devastating, and they'd lose all their freedoms. So this is I part of it is believing what you're told is such a dangerous thing.
It's so easy.
Yeah, I know.
To speak to that point, I find it absolutely hilarious how much whining is coming out of Britain for Brexit from people who are now realizing what actual Brexit means to their food prices, to their fuel prices, to their healthcare prices. It's absolutely amazing.
And yeah, and of course, should it be a surprise? No, because they were told. They were told. So
they just wanted those immigrants not to come there anymore. That was it. They will do anything else if they say that we won't bring non-white people into the country.
They wanted their sovereignty. How dare the continent tell us what to do? Oh wait, I still want to sell to that continent, which means I still have to follow those rules. Oh well.
All right. Yeah, and when you say that the right is going to lose their freedoms, I don't think they really care as long as the libs are angry. As long as the libs are enraged about something, that's all that really matters to them.
Well, let's just say we eliminated Medicaid and SNAP, which is what the Congress says they want to do. The biggest customers for Medicaid and SNAP are low-income whites. So that they don't see it coming.
They don't believe that. Yep, they don't believe they're on welfare. It's only the other people that are on welfare. All right, let's keep going. Got a few more. All right, sector balances. This is a technical topic, but it has some important implications. The government, there are three sectors in the economy: foreign, domestic, and government. And the government sector is basically the budget deficit for the most part. The domestic private, the foreign sector is your trade deficit. And it's looked at from the foreign perspective, so it's a surplus, it's above zero. And then the domestic private sector is really defined, it's the difference. It's really the savings minus investment in the private sector. But here's the catch with this. If you were to draw a vertical line at any point on this graph, every annual point, they must add to zero by definition in how these things are defined. And where we're headed with this is that each line tells you whether that group is adding to its net worth or it's getting more negative, meaning is the entity becoming more of a lender or more of a borrower? And let's stick with the government for a minute, because I think everybody gets the idea of the budget deficit and the debt, because we always talk about it. So if you look at the red line, back in the Clinton era, late 90s, early 00s, we actually had a surplus in the government sector, and that's been a deficit ever since, and very large deficit in a couple of big years, 2009, 2020, when we had crises. The foreign sector has been sort of in this range of, 3-ish, climbed for a while, but it's been in this sort of 2.5 to 3.5 range for a while, 3.7 lately. The domestic sector, I think the easiest way to think about it is just as the difference for now. The government is borrowing, and so it is becoming its net worth is going more and more negative. We have a trade deficit, and so the foreign sector, everybody else, is getting our money. We're buying their stuff, they're getting our money. They're getting richer, so to speak. The foreign sector has a surplus and has for quite some time. The U.S. has been sending our money overseas for stuff, net, and that difference is the domestic private sector. The argument that people that built this model and who believe in it and use it to make strategic decisions are that what they say is that you do not want your domestic private sector to be in deficit, meaning that is draining money away from consumers. And so if you look at, as much as we love the fact that Clinton ran a surplus, because we also had a decent sized trade deficit, consumers, they were draining the private sector. And that happened from 99. On this graph, it was before that even a little bit, but it goes all the way until 2008. Some of the economists that use this model started warning around 2003. They started getting really upset around 2005, saying we are headed to an imminent crisis because the private sector has been adding debt for quite some time. And we knew it as the housing bubble eventually, but they were using this model. They have predicted, and they do not like to see this green line below zero. They want the private sector adding to its net worth. They do not want to see it in debt. And the way it works is that essentially when the government spends money, it injects it into the private sector, and the private sector can then decide to spend that money internally, or it can spend it on foreign stuff and buy imports, in which case money comes out. So there's often a diagram of this. It's like a bathtub where the government is pouring the water into the bathtub, and the trade deficit is the drain at the bottom with the money coming out. And so what that means over time is that you want your government budget deficit to be about the same size or bigger than your trade deficit, your foreign sector surplus. So if the foreign sector is at 3.7% of GDP, and let's say it was going to be there forever, we would want to run a government budget deficit of about 3.7% of GDP. That is the basic theory. So you do not want that green line to go negative. You want the private sector adding. So there's some text at the bottom that explains what I just said verbally, so you have it. But the idea here would be lately, that green line has been positive. It almost got negative in 2015, but it's been positive, and that is a good thing. You don't want what we had happen in 2020 was a little crazy. So if you look in here for sort of a Goldilocks period, somewhere probably, if you look around 2013, 2012, where you had a reasonably small budget deficit in that 4% of GDP range, you had a private sector surplus and a foreign sector surplus. So look where that green line and the blue line touch. I think we had that in 2012, looks like 13, it looks like, 2012, 13. Again, in 2018, 19, that's kind of where you want things to be. And then, of course, we've had some craziness happen with the pandemic and all that, and that all went out the window. But this is the theory. So let's go to the next slide. And this is what I was explaining. Over here is the government, and this is a more math-oriented way to look at it. And this is sort of the proof if you want to get into it. But what's really happening is the government is spending money into the private sector, and it's taking money out as taxes. So the government balance is T minus G, taxes that are coming in minus its spending. It's in surplus if that's positive. Taxes are more than government spending. And it's negative in the US. It's a negative where G is a lot bigger than T. And that's good news for the private sector. It's picking up a lot of this G. A lot of this government spending is coming in. That's a good thing. But the private sector then imports stuff. It sends money overseas and gets stuff in exchange. And I simplified earlier when I said trade deficit. The more accurate way to say what that foreign sector balance is called the current account. So there are also some investment related, like dividends and interest that are also going back and forth between countries. I'm going to use the trade deficit because I think people get the idea of imports greater than exports, but there is this other, and that's the vast majority of it. I'll show you a slide on that in a minute, but technically it's this current account idea. I just wanted you to understand that background. But it's mostly trade. Again, that bathtub analogy, government injects money into the private sector, the foreign. If we're importing a lot of stuff and sending our money overseas, it's a drain on that private sector. So let's think about it from a policy perspective if you're going to do something. So let's say you're on the left side, your policy action or your scenario. If you increase the budget deficit, so you cut taxes or you raise spending by 2% of GDP, remember that these three sectors must balance, or the changes in the three sectors must balance to zero. So if the government sector is going to go 2% of GDP further, the deficit is going to get 2% of GDP bigger, then either the private sector is going to absorb all that, or the private sector is going to take that money and then buy more imports. And so what you see typically happen is something like this, where the government is raising the budget deficit, makes it bigger, and some of that money is going to go into the private sector. That's good news. Some of it is going to go through the private sector and out to the foreign sector. And so those three numbers all add up. And actually the government sector would be, it should be -2. And then you'd have the 0.5. Just look at the red. Red means negative. So if the government sector is going to go down by 2, the others are going to go up by a total of 2. And I've got some extra text over here on the right-hand side, but what the government has essentially done is put more money in the hands of the private sector. And also what it did is the private sector then gave it to the foreign sector. Second scenario would be if you go the other way. You reduce the budget deficit, you raise taxes or cut spending by 2% of GDP. Government sector goes up. So it's still, in our case, it would still be negative. It would still be a deficit, but it would be going upward. The deficit would be falling, moving toward a surplus condition, towards zero. But in this case, okay, so you're taking all this money out of the private sector. So some of that's going to hit the private sector directly, but also they're not going to spend as much on imports. So they're going to take some of that out of the foreign sector. So again, those numbers add up to zero. The up and the down offset each other. The last situation would be if you were, let's say you're going to try to stop the foreign sector, you're going to stop Americans from importing stuff. So you're going to do tariffs like Trump did with China. He said, I'm going to reduce the imports and the trade deficit. I don't want that drain on the bathtub, so to speak. I don't want the money leaving the private sector. If I'm going to cut taxes and inject money into the private sector, I don't want it to leave and go to the foreign sector. So I'm going to make things more expensive in the foreign sector. That's what he was thinking with the tariffs. So initially, in theory, if there's no retaliation, if China just accepts it, then in theory, the imports become more expensive. You get less of them. The trade deficit falls, and that money stays in the U.S., and you would get the Goldilocks scenario, that upper one. I'm not using a number in this case. I'm just using directional. But you would have this situation where the government gets a little extra money in tariffs. It comes in as it gets money. The foreign sector is not exporting to us. We're not importing stuff, so it's going negative, in a negative direction. And the private sector is not spending on those imports, and all that money that Trump would have injected is there from his tax cuts would be staying there. That's the theory. The bad news is, though, trade partners will retaliate. They will put on their own tariffs. Corporations will try to source in the cheapest countries possible. They have no tariffs. So instead of sourcing in China, that got the tariffs, they went to Vietnam, they went to Korea, they went wherever they could, to whatever other low-cost countries they could get the stuff from. The other thing that can happen is the dollar can appreciate because we're in more of a trade surplus position, and that can also reverse these gains. So what tends to happen is if you try to sort of manage your trade deficit directly, you try to cut the trade deficit, make it smaller, it's extremely difficult to do that because you might have some success initially, but then there's going to be a reaction from the rest of the world. So they'll impose tariffs on us. They won't buy our exports. So let's say we're successful with the tariffs and the imports fall, but then our exports fall because they retaliate. They don't want to buy our exports. They're saying, you're not going to take my import. You're not going to take my stuff. I'm not going to take yours. And that's the retaliation that you get. And the corporations will always find the lowest cost provider. So if China is artificially now more expensive, they'll go to Vietnam. And so you're still going to have a trade deficit. You'll just have it with Vietnam instead of China. So there's no easy way around it. If you make your country, when you think about countries in the world that have trade surpluses, like Germany, less so now, but China did for a while, but Germany is a great example. Germany has a long-standing trade surplus. Their currency does not appreciate because they're the most competitive in Europe, but what did they do? They got on the euro. And so all these other countries are on the euro too. So Germany can't see the Deutsche Mark appreciate and eliminate that advantage that they have. So they have captive customers, essentially. They can maintain a trade surplus. And if you would go back a second, Karl, to that first slide with the 3 lines on it, Germany, actually, they have their foreign sector is in deficit, meaning that blue line for them is below is a negative thing. They have a surplus with the rest of the world. The rest of the world has a deficit with them. What that allows them to do is run a small government deficit, and their foreign sector can still look good. I'm sorry, their domestic sector can still look good. Because the trade deficit is actually a surplus, they can actually run a budget surplus or a very small budget deficit and get away with it. And we can't do that. Our currency floats. We don't have a captive currency like the Germans have with the rest of Europe. So we can't get away with that. So if you go back to that slide with the arrows, there's no easy way for us to get that trade deficit down by doing trade policies because of the way the world will react to it. If you go the other way, where if you really don't like the trade deficit, if you want to get the trade deficit down, you just have an issue with it, and you just don't like it for whatever reason, one of the best ways to do it is to cut your budget deficit, because then people won't have the money to spend on the foreign sector. It's sort of that second row here. You do that, and that brings the foreign sector surplus down, and your trade deficit falls. So I know this is we do this about once a year. I go through this sort of piece because there's something called sector balances. There's a Wikipedia article on this that goes into this. You didn't pick up my fast talking. I helped write this out there, so it helps understand it. But it is a fascinating concept that you do not want your budget balance. You should not be going, I want a budget that is balanced. You should be saying, I want a budget deficit that is about the same size as my trade deficit on average. When the economy is booming like it is now, would it be great if our budget deficit was more like a surplus or closer to zero? Probably, but not always. And you want to drain some money out of the private sector. That's what the Fed is trying to do, and the government is doing some of it by lowering the budget deficit, but could be doing more by raising taxes. There are a variety of things that the government could be doing to slow down the economy right now and get that inflation under control even quicker. So I'll pause there. Questions on this?
I just love this chart.
Oh, I was going to say the same thing, Christine.
So
I think this is a great chart, but where's David?
It's simple.
Yeah.
It's not, because it strives to be simple, it's not very accurate. The concepts are fine.
Go, Christine, lay it out. I know, because this is one of the coolest concepts in economics, I think. It really is. And I should have put the negative and the pluses on here. I just used the red and the green, but each row should add to zero. So like the first one would be -2, +5, +1.5, but think of the red or the green as either a plus or a negative. And that will help with that gives you the zero math.
Right. So if you go back 2 slides.
Lay it
again.
on us, Christine. Go. Tell us all about it.
Right. Yeah. Go back 2 slides. So what is very fascinating, right, is the government ran a surplus during Clinton's time. And notice the green line was in deficit. Where'd that money come from? If you go into deficit, who did the private sector go into deficit to? Well, the banks. Instead of being in debt to ourselves as a society, private sector was placed in debt to other private entities, the banks. Notice the foreign sector didn't move very much. Notice how little difference that made, which is why the chart, the slide 2 further down, I don't like. because this chart completely, blows out their chart. Okay, here's real numbers, not a fantasy chart or fantasy slide, making the government a source of monetary tokens go into surplus simply meant that the rest of us borrowed tokens from a private entity to pay them. Again, the government is us. This is hilarious. All right. So wouldn't it be better if we created tokens via our common collective and use those to trade with each other versus borrowing tokens, which by definition have to expire? Most of us, when we get a loan, it has a term. That money disappears.
I would argue it different. Now, you said banks, borrowing from banks. The way I would look at this thing literally is we were borrowing from foreigners.
No, we didn't.
Well, it's balancing. I mean, we had to be borrowing. We were borrowing from them because a trade deficit means they are lending to us. Right?
If they were lending to us, that affects the foreign sector number,
which was in surplus. Their net worth was going up.
Right, which would have lowered that number.
No. The government takes the money out here. They're running a surplus.
Understand.
They're doing it by taxing.
We actually did borrow that money from the banks, right? We did something similar in the 20s. The amount of debt we racked up, personal debt, corporate debt, was phenomenal right before the crash. So
the household debt was extremely high, like 100% of GDP for the first time ever. It went from like 70 to 100% of GDP.
Yeah, we weren't borrowing that money from foreigners.
I could argue that, but all right, fair enough.
So we were actually borrowing most of that money from from banks. That money expires. Even if we borrowed it from foreigners, that money expires. Okay, they're going to want their money back eventually. Here's the joke about the red line. Do we ever have to pay that back? Ever? And the answer is no.
No.
We owe it to ourselves. That number's meaningless. It's just a method of accounting. Every dollar spent by that red line was a transfer of either human effort or something physical for some purpose for our collective, country.
And that's the term I use, the bathtub, where the government is putting money into the private sector, and then it either stays in the private sector or it goes overseas. And what this showed us is you had this trade deficit climb from like 3%. If you go all the way to the left, the trade deficit was in that sort of 3-ish range, and it went all the way up towards 6 by the time we had the crisis. And so a lot of that is even though it doesn't look big like the green and red variances that we see on here, that huge fluctuation, it was a lot of money that was coming in from overseas that we were borrowing. The foreign sector was getting a lot richer.
No. Who was borrowing that money? The foreign sector. China does not loan that money in any significant way to the private sector. They buy They buy treasuries. China buys treasuries.
Lending to us, right? Essentially
lending to us, the collective, not lending to us, the individual.
Right, lending into the private sector. The private sector is getting in debt to China, essentially. They are borrowing from China.
We are collecting excess tokens from China by using treasuries.
I'm not sure how to translate that. I will just say, let me just go back to the model a second and just say that let me just summarize it. If you have a government that is running a surplus in the United States, if you are running a surplus and you have a trade deficit, you are draining your private sector. If you do that over a period of time, which we did from between like 99 at the end of the Clinton administration until the crisis hit, the subprime crisis, the boom, the Great Recession. You risk when you do that, you are hurt. Your private sector is borrowing lots and lots of money. Its net worth is declining. That is a risky thing to do. And so the people that economists that drive this model that swear by it. And one of them is Hatzius, the guy who's the number one economist at Goldman Sachs. He shares this chart from time to time to explain what's going on in the world. And he likes to explain it. I'm explaining it the best I can without being a pro-economist. I just use it to tell people, don't go and argue for a budget surplus that is not, it's not like you and me with our bank account. The government is very different. I think you and I would agree on that, Christine.
Oh yes, we are agreeing loudly.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
But
the subtlety is important.
Yeah. Okay. I have to understand your argument better. You're usually right. I just don't follow everything you say, so I apologize. All this slide is just if you care about the current account and the differences between the trade, it's here. It talks about this idea of there's primary income, services, goods, and secondary income, and there's a bunch of terminology with that, but it's basically investment flows. There's dividends and interest from, they own American treasuries, and so they pay us interest, and we own their bonds, and we pay them interest. It's the flow of money, just like imports and exports are money in exchange for goods. It just, when you see this, you can see that the goods, this gray part, are the vast majority of it, and the goods and services as part of the trade deficit. The primary income and the secondary income aren't very much, and they're somewhat offsetting, I think. So it's the current account technically is that line, that trade. I call it the trade deficit or the foreign sector, but that's really the current account.
Yep. Go ahead and finish your presentation.
Yeah, last two things. Okay. So there's a couple slides here. I update these all the time, which is the Biden records, a bunch of the economic record, but a lot of records listed here. So this is an easy slide to share that has a lot of good news on the economy. And this one is just a comparison of the 2019 average and the 2022 average on a lot of these key measures. And so 2022, better than 2019, and Trumpers will go to their grave saying 2019 was the best economic year ever. I can show you this chart and tell you that on almost every key measure, we were better off in 2022, adjusted for inflation. That's what real means. And that's footnoted at the bottom. So, all right, the last slide, we have some links that you can go to look for some of this stuff. Some key sources, the sector balance is on there. There's an article about how much better Democrats are for the economy from the New York Times. These are easy things to share too, if you so choose. So that ends our prepared comments.